This month marks the 25th anniversary of the Mana series, which began on weird terms. The first game launched for the Game Boy in the US sometime in November 1991 as Final Fantasy Adventure. In Japan, it was released as Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden on June 28, 1991. Seiken Densetsu roughly translates into Legend of the Sacred Sword, and Gaiden, for those who don't know, usually refers to a side game in most Japanese releases. Funnily enough, in Europe, it was called Final Fantasy Mystic Quest for its 1993 debut, which is the name of another Final Fantasy spin-off for the Super Nintendo of the same name. That game in Europe is called Mystic Quest Legend, in Japan it's Final Fantasy USA Mystic Quest. That certainly is a mouthful, but anyway, putting aside the confusing name game, Final Fantasy Adventure was set up as a Zelda-type hack and slash, but with more RPG elements. The camera is set with a top-down perspective. You begin fighting enemies with a sword and shield, wherein you gain levels and magic via experience. It has dungeons, but it's definitely not puzzle-focused compared to the aforementioned Zelda series. For my 14th golden birthday in 2001, my brother bought me a teal Game Boy Color with Final Fantasy Adventure, as you're seeing right here. Now, while this didn't take advantage of the Game Boy Color's new graphical prowess, I loved it regardless. I remember being stuck though with a particular puzzle wherein the game hints at palm trees and the figure 8. It was obscure, but eventually with the power of GameFAQs via a friend's internet connection, I was able to figure it out. Weird puzzles aside, it's a fantastic game, but it actually wasn't my first Mana game. That honor would go to the second game in the series, Secret of Mana, which was released for the Super Nintendo on October 3rd, 1993. For Japan, it was simply titled Seiken Densetsu 2, and marked the previous spin-off for Final Fantasy into its own series, which was dubbed Mana in the West. Now, it built off of the lore of the previous game, but is about its own set of new characters. Overall, it's a more fully realized vision in terms of the mechanics, story, music, graphics, and everything in between. It even offered up to 3-player co-op. For me, and many others, it's considered the best game in the franchise. I first got my hands on Secret of Mana when a Funkoland opened up around my area. I wanted to buy Chrono Trigger, but it was about $80, so I settled for Secret of Mana instead for around $30. While I never heard about it before, I knew Square, so I tried it out and was pleasantly surprised. Now, I mentioned it offered co-op, but I never found that out until college when a friend told me how he played it all the time with 2 others. Needless to say, I was blown away, more so by my own ignorance, but it just added another great feature to one of the best games of all time. Seiken Densetsu 3 is the 3rd game in the series, released only in Japan on September 30th, 1985 for the Super Famicom. It has since never been released anywhere else, though a fan-translated version has been available online since 2000. That being said, I've since checked it out, and I'm incredibly baffled why it hasn't been released anywhere else yet. It's gorgeous and even more ambitious than Secret of Mana. Like Final Fantasy, the trend with the Mana series seemed to be experimentation with each new title. Now, at its core, Seiken Densetsu 3 is an action RPG, true, but at the outset you are tasked with choosing 3 out of 6 playable characters. Of those 3, you choose who to begin with, while the other 2 join later as you progress through the story. As customizable as it narratively goes the same direction no matter what, but the journey is definitely different. Another feature setting it apart from its predecessor is the class system and allocation of ability points. When you level up, you can increase stats like Dungeons & Dragons, then at the 18th level, a hero can choose a light or dark class to align with. There's also a day and night cycle along with an in-game calendar that affects the game in myriad of ways. For a 1995 Super Famicom game, it was innovative and is still a rarity in games today. The next Mana game the West would receive would be Legend of Mana for the original PlayStation on June 6, 2000. Like those before, Legend of Mana tried to do something new with its world and RPG mechanics, and because of this, it received mixed reviews. Personally, I find the watercolor-esque visuals astounding to this day, and the actual combat is true to its action RPG roots, but there are problems with it though. Instead of offering multiple characters, players can choose between a male or female avatar along with a weapon class ranging from a knife, sword, axe, two-handed sword, two-handed axe, hammer, or shield. The perspective is more 2D, getting rid of the top-down perspective, and the story has been put aside. Depending on where you place dungeons on the map, this will affect the world in some way, i.e., in order to 100% the game game, one must take caution. Altogether, it's confusing, and even with the perfect allocation, the plot is barren, which in itself is okay to allow players a more flexible adventure, like the original Zelda to dial it back a bit, but it doesn't evoke the classic appeal of the first 3 Mana games before it. Sword of Mana, released for the Game Boy Advance in the US on December 1st, 2003, is a complete remake of Final Fantasy Adventure. It's essentially the same game, but with an elaborated story and beefier gameplay mechanics, along with a graphical overhaul looking something similar to Seiken Densetsu 3, and like Legend of Mana, you can decide to be male or female. To clarify for those unwilling to do the math, Sword of Mana is a remake only after 4 games in the span of little more than 10 years after its initial launch. For me, it's a fine remake, but the narrative inclusions kind of get in the way. Children of Mana, the 6th or 5th game depending on if you count Sword of Mana as the 5th, launched for the Nintendo DS on October 30th, 2006 in the US. It's still an action RPG, but instead of venturing out on a magical globe-trotting tour, you instead dive into a dungeon. The maps are randomly generated as you dive deeper, and because of this and the one basic set of locations, it gets repetitive fast. I will say it looks great for the handheld though. One game I have no experience with, along with seemingly most of the internet, is Friends of Mana. It debuted on Japanese phones sometime in 2006, and the server shut down on February 28, 2001. It was essentially a smaller scale 2D MMORPG from what I've seen. Moving on to the next game, Dawn of Mana, amazingly released for the PS2 post-launch of the PS3. It released on May 24, 2000 in the US. While it is the 8th released game in Japan, it was titled Seiken Densetsu 4 to sort of market it as the next big step for the franchise. It's remarkable for being the first and only 3D Mana. It is very similar to Kingdom Hearts' combat system, wonky camera and all. While there is stat progression, Dawn of Mana emphasized platforming, throwing objects, and reliance on monster allies, so technically, I would dub it as an action-adventure rather than an action RPG, but genres, especially in RPGs, are arbitrary on many levels. Setting that vast subject aside for another day, I found the step into 3D impressive. Like Final Fantasy XII, that also released late in the PS2 cycle, Dawn of Mana graphically holds up well thanks to its colorful palette. The action is sound, but thanks to the aforementioned bad camera, it makes for more frustrating traversal, not to mention the story is bland, and the accompanying cutscenes are drawn out with poor voice acting. Due to its lists of problems, and probably because it released a year after the new console generation with the PS3, it's the poorest reviewed Mana with a current Metacritic of 57 out of 100 out of 27 critics. Now, Heroes of Mana is the last game I physically played on this list. It launched for the Nintendo DS on August 14, 2007 in the US, just a few months after Dawn of Mana. Like the other DS game, Heroes of Mana is another rough departure, with it acting like a mini RTS. Your hero doesn't particularly participate in battle, but instead you create familiar monsters from the franchise and use them to gather resources to make more, and thus fight off hordes of enemies. Again, while interesting in terms of taking the mechanics elsewhere, I didn't find it much fun. The last 3 titles were all released first on Japanese mobile devices. First, there was Circle of Mana in 2013, a card-based RPG. Second, Rise of Mana in 2014, a free-to-play 8-player co-op action RPG. Third, another remake of the original Adventures of Mana, which released on February 4, 2016. The first 2 never made it out of Japan, even though Rise of Mana was ported to the PS Vita. However, Adventures of Mana was ported this year to the PS Vita and released digitally in the US and Europe on June 28, 2016. Unlike Sword of Mana, this game falls more in line with the original's vision, just with some new flourishes. And that's it! Technically, you could say the Mana series is alive and well, but I would argue due to its finicky nature between its games that it hasn't been properly treated since Dawn of Mana. Even though it wasn't very good, I thought it was a good attempt to push the series forward. It's incredible that's the only 3D game in a list of 12, and of those 12, 3 of them are remakes of the first game. Where should the series go now? By Square Enix's apparent actions, it seems they don't emphasize much stock on this once bright RPG flagship from their armada of franchises. Personally, I would settle for a proper release of Seiken Densetsu 3 in the West, or better yet, a 3D remake of Secret of Mana on PS4, or I would even settle for the 3DS or PS Vita. Dare I even hope for a new Mana game set in a 3D world. All in all, no matter its future, I love what this series once stood for, and not what it's become. So to you, Mana and Seiken Densetsu, and I guess even Mystic Quest for those Europeans, I wish you a very happy 25th anniversary. Did you know that was a ReActionExaminer video? If you liked it, you should subscribe to me to keep up with everything that I'm doing. Also, if you have some other interests, like sex for example, check out Tomops, which is a comedy sex podcast thing wherein my best friend and I check out the weird and abnormal and the erotic. And of course, you should support me on Patreon because, hey, I want to make the channel better and I want your help to do so. Plus, if you want to check out my writing, check out Game Jerk, where I have archives and new stuff for all projects, okay? You can find all the stuff and more in the description with the links below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all next time.